In this video, you're going to learn a new concept in ES6 called arrow functions. So what's an arrow function? So let's first create an example using ES5 where you add an event listener to a button. So you've got a few buttons here. Each button has got an ID. So the first one has got an ID button 1, then button 2, and so on. So we're going to attach an event to the first button. So in ES5, you need to do that using the add event listener method. So the event is click, and our function, for example, is going to log something like ES5. So if I save and try this, then it's logging ES5. Perfect. Now in ES6, there is a new way of doing the same thing. So you're going to do that to the second button, which has got an ID button 2. And we're going to use an arrow function. So instead of using this function expression like that, the arrow function is going to be slightly different. So instead of function, we're going to have parentheses where you would normally place the arguments or the parameters of the function. So since we don't have any arguments, that's going to be empty. And then you're going to have an arrow. And this is why we call them arrow functions. So let's make this one log 6. So again, the syntax is parentheses and then arrow, which is an equal sign followed by a greater than sign, and then you've got your function code inside curly brackets or inside a block. So if I save and try this, then we get the right result. So this is what an arrow function is. Now let's have a quick look at some other examples. So let's define an array list and have something like that inside. And let's create a new list using ES5 syntax. So this list is going to be created using the first list by taking every element and multiplying it by 2. So let's call it list1. And if you remember, we're going to use the method map of arrays, which takes a function. And that function is going to be applied to the elements of the original array and will return the new array. So we want a function which takes a parameter x and returns x multiplied by 2. So now if I log list1, I'm going to get 2 and 6. All right, now in ES6, let's use an arrow function instead of this function expression like that. So we're going to call it list2 this time. And our function is going to be an arrow function. So instead of function of x, we're going to have x inside parentheses and then an arrow like that. So let's log list2 and you get the correct result. All right. Now there is a new way of writing this function, which is going to be a lot easier. So when you have an arrow function which has got a return statements like that, you can actually simplify the whole function like this. So if I create a new list, call it this time list 3. So instead of having X and then the arrow and then the code inside a block, I can actually, or before moving there, you don't have to place X inside parentheses. You can also write X like that if you like. And that's correct. Okay, so now instead of having the code inside a block like that, we're going to delete all of this. And instead of having the return statements, we're going to keep only what is being returned. Like this. So let's make sure that this is working. So list 3, and we get the correct results. Perfect. So this is a very easy way of writing arrow functions, and it makes your programming experience really a lot easier. Now you're going to move to something really interesting. You're going to be exploring the scope of this inside an arrow function. So first, let's go back to ES5 and see the scope of this inside a function. So for example, let's create an event listener which will listen to a click event on that button. So let's copy this code and change it slightly. So we are looking at the button of ID button 3. And this time, let's log this dot inner HTML. All right, so if I save and click on the button, we get the correct inner HTML of that button. And that's because this here is referring to our button, to which we are attaching the add event listener method. And you must be already familiar with this in ES5. All right. When you are attaching an event listener to an object, you know that functions inside that event listener or inside that method, they have this element referring to the object. So this here is the button. Okay, right. So now let's move to ES6 and use an arrow function. So this time, let's copy this code and change it to button 4. And we're going to be logging this dot inner HTML. So let's save and try this. And we get undefined. So instead of getting the correct inner HTML of our button, we're getting undefined. And the reason why is because this has a lexical scope inside arrow functions, which is the same scope as the function. Now our function, or our arrow function, has got a scope which is, or a lexical scope which is window. All right. And this will take, or will follow the same lexical scope of our function, even though the function is actually called inside a method which is attached to an object. So you would expect this to refer to the button, but if you use an arrow function, it doesn't work like that. This will refer to the same lexical scope of the function. And the lexical scope of this function here is window. All right. So this here is referring to the window object. All right. Perfect. So this is very important to understand. So we're going to have another example just to make sure that you get this right. So first, let's go back to ES5 and create an object. Let's call it player 5. So this object is going to have properties and methods. So let's give it a name. And let's give it a property hover. So we're going to define a function. Okay. And this function will attach an event listener to that button. Right. So let's select the button. We'll just copy the code from there. We're selecting the button 5 and we're adding an event listener. So the event is going to be click. Right. And the function is going to be as following. So let's log hello plus this. So the idea here is to log hello followed by the name of our player. Now, if you run this code, so you've got an error somewhere. This time, let's go back to ES5 first and create an object. Let's call it player 5. So this object is going to have a property name and a method. Let's call it click. So inside this method, we're going to call this at some point. All right. So what this method is going to be doing, it's going to be attaching an event to that button. So let's select the button using its ID, button 5, and we are adding an event listener here. The event is click, and the function is going to do something like logging hello followed by the name of the player. So this dot name. So we're going to see if we get the correct result. Okay. So let's call the method click and see what we get. So if we click on the button, we get hello, and we don't get anything after that. Now, if we just log this like that, we get the button to which we attach the event using the add event listener method. So we were expecting to get the object itself, but we got the button itself. And this is absolutely normal because we know that in ES5, if you have a function like that inside a method attached to an object, you know that this inside the function is going to refer to the object. And if you remember, in ES5, we had a way to overcome that. You had to create another variable before attaching the method. So let's call it, for example, player, and you store the element this inside this variable. So this is how we used to overcome this in ES5. Now if you try this and you call the player right there, then you know that you're going to get the correct value of this, which is the object to which click is attached, right? So again, this here is inside that function or that method, and that method is attached to that object. So this is going to refer to that object, and this is applicable in ES5. So let's try, and you get this time the object. So if you log player dot name, you should get the correct results. All right, so that's what's happening in ES5. Now let's move to ES6. Now with the lexical scope of this inside ES6, things are going to change. So let's copy this code. And let's call our player 6. And the button 6 this time. So let's delete that line. And this time we're going to use an arrow function like this. So parentheses, then an arrow. Then we are logging this time this dot name. So let's see what happens. And we are getting John. Now, unlike ES5, this is working straight away without having to add a new line storing this right there. And the reason why is because this becomes lexical here, because it's inside an arrow function. So the scope of this is lexical, and the lexical scope here is inside the player 6 objects. So this will always refer to the player 6 objects wherever you call it inside the object. If you wrote this line in the global scope, then this would refer to the window object, and that's the lexical scope of your function in that case. Now again, the lexical scope of your function in this case is player 6, our objects. All right, so hopefully this makes all sense, and in the next few videos we're going to cover other new features in ES6.